The Peloponnesian War was a brutal conflict between two of ancient Greece's most powerful city-states, Athens and Sparta. This week, we're going to decode this war to understand why it happened, how it unfolded, and why it matters. Before we get into the I just want to say a huge thank you to my supporters who have been absolutely amazing in their support for my work. If you too would like to support my work and be credited at the end of videos, then consider becoming a supporter through the link in the description. Okay, first things first. Let's start with a brief overview of the war itself. The Peloponnesian War was fought between two main coalitions, the Delian League led by Athens and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta. These two leagues were made up of many other smaller Greek states. While the Peloponnesian League mainly consisted of land-based states, the Delian League was primarily maritime, allowing Athens to dominate the Aegean Sea and its many islands. This control over the sea also allowed Athens to maintain an empire that stretched from the northern shores of the Black Sea all the way down to the Egyptian border. Across this massive empire, Athens collected tribute from these subject states, which it used to build up its navy and fund its war efforts against Sparta. Sparta was threatened by the growing power of Athens. Many Spartans worried that if Athens continued to grow, it might become the hegemon of all of Greece, a position that Sparta had long held. Another point of contention was the presence of Helots in both Athens and Sparta. Helots were the name given to the subjugated peoples that lived in both states. Sparta's Helot population greatly outnumbered its citizens, leading to constant fear of Helot revolts within Sparta. To mitigate this risk, Spartans took every precaution to ensure that Helots would never rise up against them. In contrast, though Athenians saw their Helots as nothing more than property and treated them terribly, Athenian Helots did revolt on several occasions, but Athens was able to put down these rebellions due to its superior military naval power. When news of these rebellions reached Sparta, they were seen as proof that Athens needed to be stopped. If Athens could treat its Helots so poorly and still win, then what is to stop it from doing the same to Sparta or even trying to dominate all of Greece? So, while there were multiple factors that contributed to the outbreak of the war, ultimately Sparta's desire to stop the growth of a potentially dangerous Athenian empire was the primary catalyst for the conflict. With that out of the way, let's get into the meat of the decoding. First off, I think it's important to point out that the Peloponnesian War is usually remembered as one of the greatest wars in ancient history. However, when viewed through the lens of total casualties, it really doesn't rank all that high. For example, in the roughly 30 years that the war was fought, somewhere between 200 and 300,000 people died. For some context, during World War II, an estimated 70 million people died. And even the deadliest war in human history, the Second World War, which lasted only 4 years, resulted in around 150 million deaths. Now, this isn't meant to diminish the Peloponnesian War in any way. The effects of this war were far-reaching and had consequences for nearly every state in Greece. But it is worth pointing out that not every war is automatically significant just because it involves ancient civilizations. Now that we got that out of the way, let us talk about the overall strategy of each side and how it affected the outcome of the war. To do this, I'm going to use a quote from Thucydides, a general from the Delian League, who, after losing the war, gave a speech explaining why his side lost. He said, "Our failure came about not from any failure of arms or strategy or want of good leadership on our part, but from the mistakes of those who were our allies." In this statement, Thucydides is saying that the reason Athens lost the war wasn't because of anything they did wrong, but rather because of the actions of their allies. In order to understand what he means, we need to look at how each side prepared for war. Athens knew that it was at a strategic disadvantage compared to Sparta. As I mentioned earlier, The Peloponnesian League had a large army, while the Delian League had a strong navy. Since the Spartans were also better fighters on land than the Athenians were, Athens knew that fighting head-on would likely result in defeat. Because of this, Athens chose to try and starve Sparta out by blockading its allies. By cutting off food and supplies to Sparta, Athens hoped that it would be able to weaken the Spartan resolve to fight. Unfortunately for Athens, though Sparta was well prepared for a siege, unlike Athens, which was built on the coast, Sparta was nestled away in the interior of the Peloponnese, making it very difficult for any potential invaders to lay siege to the city. Furthermore, Spartans were accustomed to living a hard life, and they were confident that they could endure whatever hardships Athens might throw their way. As it turned out, the Athenians did manage to blockade the Spartans for a few years, but eventually Sparta was able to find alternative trade routes and sustain itself. Athens had hoped that the Spartans would buckle first, but it ended up being the other way around. Another big difference between the two sides was how they approached diplomacy. Remember, Sparta wasn't the only major power in Greece. There were also the Thebans and the Corinthians, both of whom had reasons to want the Athenians gone. Athens knew that it didn't have enough power to take on Sparta alone, so it tried to make alliances with other states in order to strengthen its position. For example, at one point, Athens formed an alliance with the Persians. Despite their many differences, both sides agreed that neither of them liked Sparta. Athens needed Persian support to reinforce its navy and keep the Spartans from invading its empire across the sea. Similarly, the Persians were hoping that by supporting they would be able to stop the Spartans from expanding their empire into Asia Minor. Other notable alliances that Athens made included the Argives and the Overall, though Athens' strategy was to try and assemble as many allies as possible to counter the Spartans, Sparta, on the other hand, took a different approach. Instead of trying to assemble a coalition, Sparta kept to itself and relied on its own strength to win the war. This decision proved to be costly for Sparta, because it ended up fighting on multiple fronts at once. While Sparta was initially successful on the battlefield, as the war dragged on, it became increasingly difficult to sustain its victories without allies. Eventually, Sparta had to form alliances with the Corinthians and the Thebans in order to defeat the Alright, now let's move on to talking about some of the most important battles of the war. The first battle I want to discuss is the Battle of Marathon. This battle took place early on in the war and was one of the most decisive moments in its entire history. Early in the conflict, the Persians invaded Greece in an attempt to punish the Athenians for their alliance with the Persians. While the Persians vastly outnumbered the Athenians refused to back down. Despite being outnumbered, the Athenians were victorious. This victory was so important that it not only staved off the Persian threat, but it also inspired a new era of Athenian pride and power. The second battle I want to talk about is the Battle of Salamis. The Battle of Salamis was another pivotal moment in the war. It pitted the navies of the Delian League against the combined fleets of the Persian Empire and the Peloponnesian League. While the Spartans were eager to see the Persians join the war, they soon realized that having two enemies was more trouble than it was worth. That's because the Persians brought with them thousands of troops, but very few of them were actual soldiers. Most of the Persian troops were sailors, which meant that if the Persians were defeated, there wouldn't be any survivors to man their ship. With no way of transporting their troops back home, the Persians would be forced to stay in Greece and fight alongside the Spartans. Needless to say, Sparta wasn't thrilled at the prospect of having to share the spoils of war with the Persians, so it encouraged them to go home after the battle. To its relief, the Persian king was happy to accept this offer and depart. In terms of who won the war, the answer is obviously Sparta. However, In many ways, it could be argued that the real winner was Persia. Even though the Persians didn't directly intervene in the war, they still managed to come out on top. After the war, Persia was able to reassert its dominance in the region. Furthermore, by staying neutral, Persia was able to increase its wealth and power. While Sparta may have emerged victorious, it was ultimately at the expense of its own power. Over the course of the war, the Spartans had to rely more and more on the manpower of other states. In fact, by the end of the war, the Spartans were relying on non-citizens to fight on their behalf. This reliance on foreigners would lead to the decline of Spartan power and the rise of new powers in Greece. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my supporters.